Close your eyes and listen carefully to the voice you've tried to ignore all your life. The voice that warns you something is rotting beneath the polished veneer of charity and piety. Tonight, that voice is going to show you the ledger no historian dared to publish. In the bitter winter of 1879, when the last caretaker abandoned the Sunset Years Christian home, they locked every door except the one that mattered most, the hidden trapdoor beneath the chapel altar. It took decades before any living soul dared to break the seal and descend into that forgotten crawlspace, where the air was so heavy with old morphine and mildew that men had to cover their mouths to keep from choking. Down there, buried in burlap sacks, were 23 ledgers so detailed, so coldly methodical, that even hardened detectives wept as they turned the brittle pages. Each entry was a confession masquerading as an account ledger, names of the dying, doses administered, the exact day their hearts surrendered, the inheritance claimed as reward. The Porters did not think of themselves as killers. They called themselves instruments of God's will. And the most disturbing thing is, the city of Hartford agreed with them. Because if you pretend long enough that evil is charity, no one will dare call it murder. But tonight, you will. Because once you hear what I'm about to share, there's no going back to the safe, comfortable ignorance you used to mistake for truth. When you look at the faded photographs of Dr. William Porter, you see the face of a man the newspapers once praised as Hartford's healer. But photographs can't show you the shadows behind his eyes, or the quiet thrill he felt each time a new resident signed away their fortune in exchange for a promise of tender care. In truth, that promise was the first lie, a contract signed in desperation, in loneliness, in the hope that someone, anyone, would stay by their bed when the final hour arrived. The Porters understood that hope better than anyone. They understood that when you strip a man of his family, his friends, and his strength, you can convince him to call a needle full of poison an act of mercy. They perfected this manipulation so gradually that even the staff believed they were witnessing natural death. An old woman grows forgetful, a wealthy merchant loses his appetite, a veteran begins to hallucinate angels hovering by his bedside. Each symptom was catalogued, measured, recorded in the ledgers as though it were nothing more than a footnote in a patient's decline. But behind the clerical precision was something far colder, a calculation of how long the morphine would take to destroy the body without revealing the hand that delivered it. And as each inheritance passed quietly into the Porter accounts, another page turned in the ledger of secret atrocities. You think you understand greed. But you have never seen it weaponized into a doctrine, blessed by ministers who would rather look the other way than question why so many benefactors died just after rewriting their wills. Tonight, I'm going to drag you through every chamber of that house. I will show you the black stain no amount of prayer could wash away. Imagine the evening light slanting through stained glass, washing the dining hall in bruised colors, wine red, decaying gold, the sickly green of old glass. At every polished table sat a life measured in dollars, frail bodies draped in clean linens, silver hair combed back to hide the tremors in their hands. They thought they were safe here. They thought the Sunset Years Christian home was the last shelter before the grave. But each night, when the staff retired and the gas lamps flickered low, the real work began. Dr. Porter would pace the corridors in his spotless coat, ledger in one hand, vial in the other. He would pause by each door, listening to the ragged breathing on the other side. Then he would slip in, whispering scripture as he drew the needle. He called it easing the passage, but it was nothing more than a harvest, a ritual of quiet extermination perfected over decades. What chills me most is not that he believed he was righteous, but that the city believed it too. Margaret, his wife, was no passive accomplice. She kept the ledger entries neat, recording each false diagnosis with the same devotion she once reserved for prayer. And Sarah, her sister, learned to forge signatures so perfectly that even the probate courts were fooled. They had studied the laws, learned the loopholes, and trained themselves to perform grief with such sincerity that no one questioned why every death meant another windfall. You were taught that evil wears a monstrous face, that you'd recognize it by the blood on its hands or the madness in its eyes. But the Porters prove how wrong you were. Evil can be polite. It can serve you tea, sing hymns at your bedside, and look you in the eye as it robs you of everything. That is the lesson buried under the floorboards. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the ledger pages turning in the dark, tallying the final cost of every life stolen. This isn't just history. It's a blueprint, a manual of how the powerful prey on the forgotten. And if you think you are immune because you're not old or alone yet, you are already standing closer to the trapdoor than you care to admit. They called it a sanctuary. Sunset Year's Christian Home. A name that wrapped its true purpose in comforting words, like a silken shroud laid over a corpse. But in the brittle ledgers hidden under the floorboards, you will find no mention of sanctuary, only transactions, each life reduced to an entry and a balance. It was all so meticulously planned that by the time a resident signed their admissions papers, their death had already been penciled into a private calendar. A date to be reached with precise increments of morphine and laudanum, until the heartbeat faltered just enough to appear natural. People who walked those halls in the daylight believed what they were shown. They saw flowers in every vase, the Bible on every nightstand, and the benevolent smile of Dr. Porter as he escorted them on tours. They saw the old women kneeling in the chapel, whispering prayers for peace, never realizing that the man leading their services would be the same one to slip poison into their medicine. Those visitors left comforted, certain they had chosen the finest Christian care for their loved ones. None of them ever thought to ask why the staff changed so often, why new nurses arrived every few months and left without notice. If they had dared to question, they would have learned about Nurse Abigail Stowe, who stumbled onto the truth when she found a vial mislabeled as heart tonic. She never told another soul, because she vanished that same week. Her name was erased from the employment rolls, her pay records destroyed, as if she had never existed. That is how the Porters worked, no confrontation, no scandal, just a quiet removal of any obstacle. Every time you think you've reached the bottom of this story, it will drop away beneath you again. Because this was not an isolated horror, it was an institution, built to look pious and selfless while it devoured everything entrusted to its care. And it thrived because decent people could not believe such cruelty could be hidden behind a hymn book. Tonight, you will believe it. You will believe it because you can still smell the morphine when you open those ledgers, because you can still feel the cold calculation in the ink that recorded each death as a profit. And once you've seen it, you will never mistake respectability for innocence again. Every page of those ledgers was a confession whispered in code. You can almost hear the pen scratching across the parchment by candlelight as Dr. Porter chronicled each extinguished life with the same detachment a banker uses to record interest payments. But there were moments, buried in the margins, when his mask slipped. Short, unsettling phrases scrawled in the dark, method superior, no resistance. Inheritance secured without suspicion. The Lord provides. What kind of mind justifies murder as divine providence? What kind of soul believes that to steal a life is to do God's work? Perhaps the most disturbing detail is how the Porters refined their process over the years. Early on, some residents lingered too long, their decline unpredictable, their final days marked by confusion that could alarm the staff. So Dr. Porter began experimenting with mixtures, morphine to erode the mind, arsenic to cripple the organs, laudanum to lull the body into a dreamless coma. Each death became smoother, quieter, easier to disguise. The staff was trained to record the symptoms exactly as the Porters dictated: senility, heart failure, natural causes. You need to understand, this was never improvisation. It was a system perfected by repetition. A system that grew so bold it began to expand beyond Hartford itself. Records show that as the reputation of the home spread, wealthy families from Boston, Providence, even New York entrusted their aging parents to the Porters, never suspecting that they were delivering them straight into a carefully curated slaughterhouse. And every time the ledgers grew fat with another fortune, the home added new luxuries: rose gardens, a music room, a library filled with leather-bound Bibles, all purchased with the inheritance of the dead. But the most chilling line in all 23 volumes was written in 1864, after the death of Mrs. Lydia Carroway. Under her name, in small, precise letters, Dr. Porter wrote, "Perfection. No suspicion. No grief. Only gratitude." That sentence has haunted me more than any ghost story. Because in it, you see the final evolution of evil, not just the ability to kill, but the belief that murder is an act of grace. If you feel something shifting inside you as you hear this, that is your last defense cracking. Because the truth is not merely unsettling, it is transformative. And once you have looked into this abyss, you will never again believe that virtue cannot be faked, that trust cannot be weaponized, that evil always shows its teeth. Sometimes, evil wears the face of kindness and waits for you to thank it as you die. Look closely at the photographs taken in the grand parlor of the Sunset Years Christian home. The gaslight gleams on polished oak paneling. Lace curtains frame the windows. And in the center of it all, a line of solemn figures, Dr. Porter in his immaculate suit, Margaret with her folded hands, Sarah with her gentle, unsmiling eyes. To the untrained observer, this was the portrait of respectable charity. But if you knew what lay beneath their feet, those sacks of ledgers, that hidden ledger room with its rank chemical air, you would see it for what it truly was, a portrait of predators posing as saviors. The rituals were always the same. A new resident would arrive, usually escorted by a distant nephew or an exhausted daughter-in-law eager to rid herself of the burden. There would be an interview in the study, a medical evaluation in the examination room, then the slow, deliberate dismantling of the residents' autonomy. First, Dr. Porter insisted on managing their medication. Next came the suggestion that Margaret assist with finances, purely for the sake of convenience, she would assure them. Within weeks, Sarah would produce new paperwork, carefully explained in soft, sorrowful tones. These signatures were never fully voluntary. They were extracted with a cunning that has no modern equivalent, equal parts religious guilt, medical intimidation, and a counterfeit compassion that disarmed the most suspicious mind. And then the schedule began. Small, measured doses administered with prayers. Detailed notes logged after every decline, appetite loss, confusion, tremors. Each symptom cross-referenced in the ledgers to prove that nothing was out of the ordinary. No one ever thought to test the bodies. No coroner ever insisted on an autopsy. The faith in the Porters was absolute. When the moment of death came, it came quietly. Margaret often sat by the bedside, brushing the victim's hair back from a damp forehead, murmuring verses of scripture while the final dose took hold. The patient would gasp once, perhaps twice, then fall silent. Within hours, the death certificate was signed, the estate transferred, the bed stripped for the next occupant. There was no remorse. No second thoughts. Only the slow accumulation of wealth and the growing certainty that their mission was sanctioned by a higher power. And that is what should unsettle you most, not that they killed, but that they believed it was right. If you are still here, still listening, understand this. You have stepped across a threshold most men never cross. You are seeing how institutions cloak corruption in virtue, how trust can be transformed into a weapon, how the gravest sins hide in plain sight, behind a cross and a smile. The more you study the Porters, the more you realize their genius wasn't simply in the act of killing, it was in their mastery of perception. They knew that the human mind is desperate to believe appearances, especially when the alternative is too monstrous to contemplate. So they cultivated an image so flawless, so reassuring, that no accusation could penetrate it. Every Christmas, they hosted a candlelit service in the home's chapel. Elderly residents, many already drugged into docility, were lined up in polished wheelchairs to sing hymns beside the towering tree. Local dignitaries attended, their pockets lined with discreet donations from the Porters' steadily growing fortune. And in the back pew, reporters scribbled glowing profiles about this Christian sanctuary for the forgotten. But in the hidden ledger room, Christmas was just another season to accelerate their plan. The elderly were more vulnerable in the cold months, respiratory failure was easy to mimic, and no one questioned why the death rate rose with the frost. The ledgers from December are among the thickest. Each entry as brief and final as an epitaph: M. Crawford, morphine administration successful, inheritance collected, December 21st. T. Wallace, arsenic, December 23rd, no suspicion. The pattern is so predictable it feels almost mechanical. You might wonder whether they ever doubted themselves. Whether in the silence before dawn, as they stood over a dying benefactor, they felt any flicker of guilt. The answer is buried in the private margin notes, written in Dr. Porter's meticulous hand. Mercy is the highest charity. The Lord rewards those who end suffering. These were not just justifications, they were the pillars of a twisted creed that transformed murder into holy duty. And the city of Hartford, so eager to believe in the myth of benevolent Christian care, became the Porters' most reliable accomplice. Ministers gave sermons praising their devotion. Newspapers reprinted their fundraising letters without a shred of scrutiny. Even the state inspectors who visited once a year never looked deeper than the fresh paint and the well-fed staff. That is how the Porters sustained their enterprise for more than 30 years, by exploiting the blindness that grows wherever people want to feel safe. You have to understand, this isn't simply a story of the past. It's a blueprint for how institutions, religious, medical, governmental, manufacture innocence to hide corruption. The Porter bloodline was never just a family, it was a prototype of every system that profits by convincing you not to look too closely. And now that you're beginning to see it, you can't unsee it. There is a reason you've never heard this story in a Sunday sermon or a school history lesson. Because to tell it honestly is to confess that entire communities can be hypnotized by the theater of righteousness. To admit that you, too, could be seduced by a kind face, a steady voice, a well-timed prayer offered over a dying body. That is the lesson hidden in the Porter's legacy. Trust is the first ingredient in every perfect crime. By the 1860s, the Sunset Years Christian home was so revered that families competed to secure a bed for their aging relatives. The Porters raised their fees, added new wings, and expanded their reach across state lines. Margaret, with her nurse's uniform and her gentle eyes, was the perfect emissary, traveling to Boston, to Providence, promising families peace of mind. But when the contracts were signed and the last tearful goodbyes were exchanged, the real ritual began. New residents were subjected to preliminary treatments, ostensibly to ease their transition. What those treatments actually did was introduce a slow, cumulative poisoning, so subtle that no visiting relative ever suspected the truth. Inside the ledgers, each death was annotated with cold precision. Dosage increased, subject compliant. Inheritance processed, $68,000. But some entries reveal more than transactions. In a note from 1868, Dr. Porter described a moment that should chill you to the bone. Subject S. Whitaker resisted final administration. Required physical restraint. Margaret's performance convincing. Subject ceased struggling after scripture recitation. Imagine it, a frail old man realizing, in his final moments, that the prayers whispered over him were not a blessing but an incantation to pacify him before the end. This was the Porter's genius, killing while performing compassion so convincingly that no witness could ever question it. It worked because Hartford wanted to believe. The city needed to believe that charity still lived in an age when industry was displacing old virtues, when fortunes were made by ruthless competition. The Porters became the symbolic antidote to that unease, living proof that faith and generosity survived. No one wanted to spoil that illusion, no matter how many funerals it concealed. That is how darkness survives, by wrapping itself in the language of virtue. And if you think this story is unique to one Victorian mansion, you're already deceiving yourself. These patterns persist wherever power meets desperation, wherever the lonely can be convinced that surrender is safer than suspicion. You're still listening because you sense this isn't just history. It's a warning, echoing through time, daring you to look at the smiling faces around you and ask, what are they hiding? As the years wore on, the Porters' operation evolved into something more than a family enterprise. It became a culture, a hidden order with its own rules, its own language, and its own hierarchy of worth. They began to categorize their victims not simply by wealth but by pliability. Those who accepted their care without question were labeled Type A, docile. Those who expressed skepticism or resisted the constant monitoring were recorded as Type C, escalation required. It was a taxonomy of vulnerability, a system for assessing how easily a life could be stolen and made to look like providence. In a ledger from 1872, you find the most chilling refinement of their process, a checklist titled Pre-Event Preparations. It included recommendations such as, establish rapport, weekly prayer sessions. Introduce mild sedatives in food. Increase religious counseling during decline. Each step engineered to dismantle the final defenses of a human soul clinging to its last scraps of autonomy. And still, the community looked on and saw only angels of mercy. Dar. Porter became a guest lecturer at medical societies, invited to speak on the management of senility. Margaret published essays in religious journals about the Christian duty to ease the suffering of the elderly. Their reputation expanded far beyond Hartford, until even the state legislature praised their model of care in official proclamations. The Porters understood something most men never do: if you feed the public's hunger for comforting lies, they will reward you beyond your imagination. But no lie, however carefully tended, stays buried forever. By the late 1870s, rumors began to circulate. A young nurse, new to the staff, unbroken by years of complicity, started to question why so many of the death certificates bore nearly identical language. She made the mistake of asking Dr. Porter directly. Within a week, she was gone, her employment record purged, her name never spoken again within the home's walls. And yet her suspicion became the seed of something larger, an unspoken dread among the remaining staff that perhaps the prayers, the rituals, the endless funerals were not holy at all, but a theater of extermination. That dread was the first crack in the edifice of respectability. A crack that, if left alone, might have healed over and vanished. But as you will see, the ledger room's secrets were too vast to stay hidden forever. Listen carefully, you are not hearing this because it is safe. You are hearing it because some knowledge is too dangerous to be silenced. And now that it has found you, it will change the way you see every institution that asks you for your trust. That in the autumn of 1878, the Sunset Years Christian Home reached its zenith. No longer merely a local refuge, it had become a pilgrimage site for affluent families from as far as Philadelphia and Baltimore. The Porters were celebrated as pioneers of compassionate care, their names invoked in sermons and charity galas alike. But the grandeur was a facade, one last flourish of respectability before the edifice began to collapse under the weight of its own atrocities. The ledgers from this final period are the most detailed, almost obsessive in their precision. Every transaction, every dosage, every performance of grief was logged with an exactness that feels less like record-keeping and more like ritual. And in those pages, you see a chilling transformation. The Porters were no longer merely killing for profit. They were killing because they believed themselves anointed, ordained to cleanse the world of the burdensome, to convert flesh and spirit into something useful. The Lord provides, Dr. Porter scrawled in the margin beside a list of morphine doses. We are his instruments. It is easy to imagine that kind of madness belongs only to history books, but I'm telling you now, it does not. Because the methods they perfected still echo through modern institutions, the incremental erosion of autonomy, the soft voice insisting that surrender is salvation, the paperwork that buries a crime in the language of care. The Porters merely showed the blueprint. Others have adapted it, refined it, hidden it under more sophisticated names. What finally began to unravel their empire was not law enforcement or journalistic curiosity, it was a single clerical error. A shipment of laudanum billed to the home was delivered in duplicate, and the druggist's assistant, puzzled by the quantities, mentioned it in town. Within days, questions began to trickle into the corridors that had always been silent. Why did a home with 30 residents require enough sedatives to numb an army? Why did every death certificate bear the same hand, the same language, the same convenient verdict of natural decline? The Porters responded as they always had, with soft assurances, carefully worded letters, and the pious conviction that no one would dare look deeper. And for a time, that was true. But the seed of doubt had been planted. In the ledger room, Dr. Porter wrote a single line beneath the final name he recorded: if discovery comes, we will meet it unafraid. It was the closest he ever came to admitting he understood what he had created. Before we continue, I want you to prove to yourself, and to me, that you are not merely a spectator to this descent. If you can feel this knowledge shifting something in you, write this in the comments right now, twice, I will not look away. Because if you don't fix this moment in your memory, you will slip back into the comfort of ignorance. And ignorance is exactly what they count on. In the winter that followed, the home's immaculate facade began to fracture. At first, it was only whispers, a nurse overheard crying in the laundry room, a delivery boy remarking that the air inside smelled wrong, like sweet rot masked by rose water. But soon the rumors took on a shape no amount of pious theater could dissolve. It started with the family of Mrs. Eleanor Whiting, a widow whose estate exceeded $120,000. They noticed inconsistencies in her letters, odd spelling mistakes, disjointed sentences, and curious mentions of new medications she'd never required before. When they wrote to inquire, they received a polite but evasive reply from Sarah Porter, assuring them that transitional treatments were essential for Mrs. Whiting's peace. And yet, before the family could press further, Eleanor died, her final days recorded in the ledgers with the same clinical detachment as all the others, decline consistent with senility, morphine administered, inheritance secured. What made this case different was that Mrs. Whiting's nephew, a lawyer from New York, refused to be soothed by letters or sermons. He arrived in Hartford unannounced, demanding to see the records. And for the first time, the Porter's careful choreography faltered. Margaret attempted to distract him with stories of Eleanor's decline, but he insisted on examining the death certificate. What he saw there, identical wording to dozens of others, signed in Dr. Porter's same steady hand, ignited something Hartford had never seen: open suspicion. Even then, the Porters might have evaded exposure. But by this time, their crimes were so numerous, so meticulously chronicled, that the truth had become too big to contain. The ledgers had multiplied like malignant cells. 23 volumes of death, each page a silent witness to 30 years of carefully staged extermination. When authorities finally searched the basement and pried up the floorboards, they found those ledgers in a canvas sack, bound in cracked leather and sealed with string. The constable who opened the first volume later described it as a moment when the world tilted, when everything he believed about Christian benevolence became a grotesque mockery. Because this was never merely about money. It was about power, the power to decide who deserved to live, the power to kill with a touch and be thanked for it, the power to erase any voice that questioned their dominion. That power did not die with the Porters. It simply adapted, put on new clothes, learned to speak with softer syllables. It waits in other institutions now, draped in the language of care and duty, relying on your desire to look away. And if you're still listening, you've already proven you won't. You are not among the many who prefer comfortable illusions. You are one of the few willing to see how darkness thrives precisely where people feel most safe. The aftermath of that discovery was not the righteous reckoning you might imagine. When word of the ledgers spread, Hartford erupted into scandal. The newspapers that had once praised the Porters now fell over themselves to print lurid headlines: House of Murder, the Benevolence Hoax, a Dynasty of Death. But beneath the public outrage, there was another, quieter sentiment, an unease that perhaps the city itself had been complicit. Because for decades, Hartford's wealthiest families had entrusted their loved ones to the Porters, never questioning the steady stream of death certificates that followed. Ministers had accepted donations stained by morphine and arsenic. Politicians had written endorsements in exchange for generous campaign contributions. The Porters' power had been built brick by brick with the willing blindness of an entire community desperate to believe that virtue could be purchased like any other commodity. At the inquest, the Porters appeared in the same somber black they wore to every funeral. Dr. Porter never wavered in his testimony. He claimed the ledgers were nothing more than clinical records, evidence of a tireless effort to ease the suffering of the elderly. Even as the prosecutors read aloud entry after entry, each one a testament to premeditated murder, he never lowered his gaze. Margaret sat beside him, her face an unreadable mask, her hands folded in silent prayer. And Sarah, the architect of the forged wills, stared straight ahead, as if she no longer inhabited the same reality as the rest of the courtroom. You may wonder how such a monstrous system survived unchallenged for so long. The answer is as simple as it is unsettling: because it was profitable. Every life extinguished added another layer to Hartford's prosperity, funding new churches, new businesses, new public works. No one wanted to see where that money came from. Even after the convictions, life sentences for Dr. Porter and Margaret, and a term of hard labor for Sarah, many in Hartford clung to the myth that the Porters were simply misunderstood, that their only crime was caring too much. You see, when a lie becomes woven into the fabric of a community, tearing it out feels more dangerous than leaving it in place. And this is why you must never mistake exposure for resolution. The truth did not end with the ledger's discovery. It simply changed shape. 100 other institutions learned the lesson, that with enough piety, enough ceremony, enough plausible paperwork, you can do almost anything to those who cannot defend themselves. If you feel a tightening in your chest, that is your instinct warning you. Because the blueprint the Porters perfected still operates, more discreet, more regulated, but no less real. You have to decide now whether you will be the man who pretends he never heard this story, or the man who carries it like a weapon, proof that evil rarely shows its true face. In the decades that followed, Hartford tried to erase the memory of the Porter bloodline. The Sunset Years Christian home was shuttered, its windows boarded up, its once pristine gardens left to rot under choking weeds. Ministers stopped mentioning the Porters' names from the pulpit. Local historians wrote them out of the city's commemorations. And the families who had sent their relatives their quietly burned letters, receipts, any evidence that they had played a part, however unwitting, in the slaughter. But no building is ever truly empty when it has absorbed that much suffering. Locals claimed the air inside the boarded-up home was thick with a cold that never left, that the floorboards still held the imprint of those who had died in drugged surrender. Even trespassers, drunk on curiosity or bravado, left shaken, claiming they had heard prayers whispered in the dark. They didn't understand that what haunted that place wasn't the ghosts of the murdered. It was the echo of a system that worked too well. And that echo carried far beyond Hartford. In Boston, Providence, and New York, other homes for the aged quietly adopted elements of the Porters' model, though no one admitted as much. New legislation was passed to increase oversight, but behind closed doors, administrators devised subtler strategies to control inheritance, to leverage trust, to profit from decline. Because the real legacy of the Porters was not their cruelty. It was their proof that, under the right disguise, cruelty can be endlessly lucrative. This is the lesson you were never meant to hear. When an institution tells you it exists to protect the vulnerable, you must look closer. Not because all charity is a lie, but because the most profitable deceptions always wear the most comforting masks. The Porters understood this better than anyone. That is why they left such meticulous records, not merely to tally the wealth they stole, but to create a guide for those who would come after them. In one of the final entries, scrawled in a slanting hand as if written in haste, Dr. Porter wrote, "When this is discovered, let it be said we did not shy from the work God set before us. Mercy is the duty of the strong." You may think these words are the ravings of a madman. But look around you, at every system that demands your unquestioning trust, every smiling intermediary who insists they alone can ease your burdens, and you will see the same mindset in polished form. What the Porters did openly, modern institutions do discreetly. The difference is not in intention, but in sophistication. And now that you know this, you have inherited a responsibility most men will spend their lives avoiding, the burden of vigilance. Remember this when you are old and someone assures you that surrender is compassion. Remember this when they offer you comfort in exchange for control. Because it is always, always the same transaction. Only the language changes. As the decades passed, the Sunset Years Christian home decayed into an empty husk. Vandals stripped the copper piping. The stained glass chapel windows were smashed by children too young to understand what had happened there. But beneath the dust and shattered glass, the structure remained, as if daring Hartford to confront the memory it embodied. Some tried to turn the house into a memorial. A group of civic leaders proposed transforming it into a museum of benevolent care, rewriting the narrative to emphasize the city's eventual courage in prosecuting the Porters. But even the most ambitious spin could not conceal the ledgers or the 189 names inscribed within them. In the end, the idea was quietly abandoned. No one wanted to stand in that place and admit how easily the Porters had seduced them. And that is the true horror of this story, not merely that 3 people killed so many, but that they convinced thousands of onlookers to smile as it happened. This is why I am telling you this in such detail, because there is a part of the human spirit that would rather be reassured than be free. The Porters built their empire on that weakness. And they were not alone. If you look into the archives of other institutions, church-run orphanages, private asylums, workhouses, you find the same patterns. A smiling authority figure. A doctrine of compassion. A ledger hidden somewhere out of sight. The language shifts, mercy, rehabilitation, charity, but the outcome remains the same, the systematic exploitation of those too frail to resist. You might feel revulsion hearing this. That is good. That means some vital part of you is still awake. But revulsion alone is not protection. The Porters counted on exactly that, on the momentary disgust that fades once the spectacle ends. That is why they left no grand confessions, no diaries of remorse. Only the ledgers, cold, precise, unrepentant. Because in the end, they knew they had proven something essential, that evil does not need to hide if it can make itself useful. There is an entry near the end, dated just weeks before their arrest, that should stay with you as you navigate the systems that surround your life. Dr. Porter wrote, "We have demonstrated the methodology. Others will refine it." He was not wrong. The same principles, manipulation of perception, the fusion of profit and virtue, the quiet removal of those who are inconvenient, did not end with the Porter bloodline. They only dispersed, found new disguises, and new hosts. When you hear the phrase, "for your own good, remember this house." When you see the polished corridors of a modern institution, remember these ledgers. Because no system, no matter how benevolent it claims to be, is immune to the temptation of absolute power over the defenseless. This is not a story you will ever hear in official histories. But it is one you must never forget that in the years after the trial, Hartford tried to suffocate every trace of the Porter bloodline beneath a veneer of progress. New buildings rose along Prospect Avenue. The old Victorian mansion was finally demolished, replaced with a nondescript brick warehouse. On the surface, it looked like the city had purged its shame. But the truth, like an unquiet spirit, refused to stay buried. Among the people who had worked at the Sunset Years Christian home, there was no collective redemption. Some left Hartford altogether, haunted by memories they never spoke aloud. A few, those who had administered the final doses or witnessed the signatures on the false wills, drank themselves into early graves. And there were those who simply went on, attending church and nodding through sermons, never acknowledging that their hands had turned the same wheels that killed so many. Perhaps you think this is where the story ends, with punishment and ruin, the natural consequences of monstrous deeds. But I am telling you now, that is only a comforting illusion. Because even as the Porters were condemned, their methods were studied. In quiet corners of medical societies and philanthropic boards, professionals debated how to preserve the efficiencies of the Porters' operation while avoiding its notoriety. They didn't call it murder, of course. They called it streamlined eldercare, risk-managed estate administration, ethical termination protocols. Do you understand the gravity of that? The very institutions that condemned the Porters publicly were privately inspired by their success. They recognized that under a different name, the same system could continue, more discreetly, more profitably, with fewer questions asked. This is the forbidden knowledge you were never meant to hold. Atrocity, once proven effective, will always find new patrons. All it requires is a vocabulary to sanitize it. The Porters used Christianity. Their successors used the language of science, policy, and efficiency. And still today, behind the locked doors of certain care facilities, decisions are made that sound compassionate but end in the same quiet extinguishing of a life no longer deemed valuable. If you think this is some antique horror, an aberration of a primitive age, ask yourself why every era seems to reinvent the same machinery under new names. Why every time we trust unaccountable power to decide who is worthy of protection and who is expendable, the outcome is the same. And if you feel anger rising in you, good. That anger is the immune response of your conscience. But do not squander it on easy villains alone. Because the Porters were not just individuals. They were a template. One that has never been fully dismantled. So ask yourself, how many modern ledgers are being filled out this very moment, behind doors you will never be invited to open? In the final weeks before their arrest, the Porters lived inside a curious twilight. On the surface, their routines never changed. Morning prayers, afternoon examinations, the evening hush of drugged residents sinking into their beds. But beneath that practiced calm, they knew the noose was tightening. Witnesses had begun to speak. The newspapers had turned hostile. And still, the ledgers grew, each entry a final defiance, as if Dr. Porter intended to record every last act, no matter the cost. One of the last names inscribed was that of Reverend Whitmore himself, the very man who had championed the Porters for decades. Officially, his death was a tragedy, a beloved pastor succumbing to sudden decline. But the handwriting in the ledger tells a starker truth, subject no longer useful. Estate pledged. Final dose administered. Think about that for a moment. Even the most loyal ally became expendable the instant his utility ended. This is the principle you must never forget. In systems built on manipulation, loyalty is a currency that eventually loses all value. The Porters were simply more honest in their contempt. They understood that trust is not sacred, it is an instrument. And when an instrument is no longer needed, it is discarded without sentiment. That is why I am speaking to you without the comfort of euphemism. Because every generation invents its own version of this machinery, an institution that pretends to serve while quietly harvesting what it needs. The names change. The slogans shift. The ledgers are encrypted in digital databases instead of leather volumes. But the arithmetic remains. One life weighed against another's profit. One signature leveraged into silence. One decline expedited so the inheritance can be secured. You might believe that transparency has solved this, that modern regulations and oversight boards have sealed off the corridors where these calculations occur. But look closely. Follow the money behind any large institution that claims to protect the vulnerable, and you will find the same cold calculus waiting. The Porter bloodline was not an anomaly, it was the first draft of a doctrine that continues to evolve. When Dr. Porter scrawled his final line, asterisk, the Lord has provided a method that shall never fail, asterisk, he was not simply recording a delusion. He was etching a prophecy. Because what they proved, what they demonstrated, is that people will tolerate any cruelty if it is wrapped in the right language. You have stayed with me this far, which means you are different. You are not the man who turns away because the truth is ugly. You are the man who will remember this when someone insists that total trust is a virtue. When they urge you to surrender autonomy in exchange for safety, recall this ledger. Recall these names. And understand, the machinery never disappeared. It only perfected itself. After the Porters were sentenced, there was a final accounting, an effort by city authorities to trace every dollar they had stolen, every life they had ended. But the ledgers were incomplete by design. Some names were recorded only as initials, some entries reduced to cryptic phrases, Subject K, inheritance diverted. Subject B, no contest anticipated. Investigators quickly realized the scale of the deception was far larger than the trial had revealed. They estimated that over 3 decades, the Porters had accumulated more than $3 million in today's currency, money siphoned from the dying under the banner of Christian mercy. And even as the public demanded restitution, the funds had already dissolved into labyrinthine accounts and shell charities. Hartford recovered almost nothing. The stolen wealth simply vanished, like water poured onto dry earth. This is another truth you were never meant to hear. In the end, no system punished them adequately. The Porters died behind stone walls, yes. But the fortune they extracted seeded other enterprises, funded other institutions, shaped the quiet architecture of respectability that Hartford clung to. And no one truly wanted to follow that trail to its end, because it would have meant admitting that the entire city had profited from the suffering it pretended to condemn. I want you to hold that image in your mind, a community eager to distance itself from scandal, yet unwilling to return the stolen inheritances. This is how corruption endures, not because everyone is evil, but because most people are too comfortable to challenge the comforts that came at someone else's cost. The final inquiry into the Sunset Years Christian home ended with a carefully worded report. It acknowledged administrative irregularities and inadequate oversight. It never used the word murder. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, the authorities preferred euphemism. Why? Because the truth threatened to expose not just the Porters, but the very foundation of the institutions that had enabled them. That impulse, to rename atrocity so it feels more palatable, has never gone away. It lives on in modern policies described as compassionate withdrawal of care, in forms that ask you to waive your rights for expedience, in procedures that reduce a human life to a set of actuarial calculations. This is what I need you to understand: the Porters were not aberrations. They were pioneers. They discovered how easily you can transform greed into benevolence, so long as no one dares to look too closely. And when you hear the comforting language of bureaucracy, best practices, ethical compliance, coordinated care, remember these ledgers. Remember that behind the most polished systems, there is often the same brutal arithmetic: who is profitable to keep alive, and who is more profitable to let slip away. Because once you see this pattern, you will never unsee it. You will recognize it everywhere. And that is when you begin to awaken. You might imagine that when the Porter's story finally leaked beyond Hartford, it would have become a national scandal, an enduring cautionary tale burned into the American conscience. But that isn't what happened. A few papers carried sensational headlines. Preachers thundered from their pulpits. Then, as quickly as the outrage ignited, it went out. Why? Because there is a kind of story most people cannot tolerate. One that suggests our cherished institutions are nothing more than well-decorated facades, fronts for ambition, greed, and control. The Porter bloodline offered precisely that kind of story. And so, like all such revelations, it was swiftly buried under more palatable narratives. Historians were quietly discouraged from revisiting the evidence. Local politicians lobbied to have the remaining documents sealed in the name of protecting community reputation. The surviving relatives of the victims accepted modest settlements on the condition they never spoke publicly. And within 20 years, the Sunset Years Christian home had vanished from public memory as if it had never existed. This is what happens to truths that threaten the architecture of power. They are not debated or disproven. They are simply erased, one record at a time. You must understand something essential: the Porters did not merely perfect a methodology for extracting wealth from the dying. They proved how malleable collective memory is. How easily the past can be shaped to protect the comfortable. One letter, written by a state archivist decades later, captures this dynamic in chilling detail: the materials pertaining to the Porter case are too inflammatory. It is not in the public interest to revive these events. Better to remember the progress Hartford has made, rather than linger on the unfortunate errors of prior generations. Unfortunate errors. That is what systematic murder becomes when it threatens the prestige of those in charge. A footnote. An inconvenience. You must decide now if you are content to let your understanding of history be curated by those who benefit from your ignorance. Because the same pattern repeats, era after era. A revelation emerges that exposes the machinery of control. For a moment, outrage flares. Then the doors close, the records are hidden, and the story dissolves into forgetfulness. This is why you must carry this knowledge like a torch, because no one will hand it to you willingly. It is dangerous to remember too much. It is dangerous to ask who profits from the erasure of truth. And it is most dangerous of all to recognize that the Porter bloodline was not an isolated horror but a template, one that institutions all over the world still quietly admire for its efficiency. If you have stayed with me this far, you are already different from most. You have become what they fear most, a man who can see past the ceremony of respectability and glimpse the machinery beneath. In the years that followed, there were whispers that the Porters had kept a second set of ledgers, records even more explicit than those discovered beneath the floorboards. Some claim these missing volumes documented not only the killings, but the names of those in Hartford's elite who benefited from the arrangement, bankers who facilitated discreet transfers, lawyers who notarized suspicious wills, ministers who vouched for the home's Christian mission. No official investigation ever confirmed the existence of these books. But there were too many rumors to ignore entirely. A caretaker who fled to New York insisted she had seen Dr. Porter reading from a ledger so damning it could destroy every pillar of Hartford society. She described pages thick with annotations, names, payments, threats, favors owed. And she claimed that on the night before the Porter's arrest, Sarah Porter burned those records in the chapel stove, weeping as she watched the pages blacken and curl. Whether those ledgers were real or imagined is almost irrelevant. Because the possibility that they existed was enough to frighten every powerful figure connected to the Sunset Years Christian home into silence. That silence is the final, most insidious legacy of the Porters. You see, they understood that complicity is a far stronger glue than ideology. If you can implicate others, make them accomplices in your scheme, they will defend you long after your crimes come to light. Not because they admire you, but because they must protect themselves. This is the pattern that has replicated itself in every corrupt institution throughout history. At the top, a small circle of orchestrators. Below them, a wider ring of collaborators who look the other way for profit or convenience. And beyond them, an even larger crowd of passive beneficiaries who will never admit they sensed something was wrong. Ask yourself, how many times in your own life have you seen a similar arrangement? A network of insiders maintaining the illusion of virtue while quietly extracting power, wealth, or submission from the unsuspecting. How often have you sensed that something was off, only to be reassured that you were imagining it? You have been taught to believe that darkness must always wear a monstrous face. But the truth is far simpler, far more unsettling. Darkness often wears the face of a respected administrator. A beloved pastor. A nurse who seems too kind to question. The Porters were never content simply to kill for profit. They wanted to prove something more profound, that almost any crime can be sanctified if you weave enough respectability around it. If you remember nothing else from this descent, remember this: the greatest atrocities are never committed by monsters alone. They are committed by ordinary men and women who convince themselves that the ends justify the means. And they are tolerated by everyone who decides that asking questions would cost too much. That is why their legacy survives. Not in the ashes of the old mansion, but in every modern system that thrives on your trust, your silence, and your instinct to look away. You may wonder why I have taken you so deep into these corridors of deceit and sanctioned cruelty. The answer is simple: because most men will never look. They will hear a story like this, shake their heads, and say, that was a different time. They will reassure themselves that modern institutions have evolved beyond such predation. But those are the comforting fictions that predators rely on. You must understand that what the Porters built was not merely a criminal enterprise, it was a proof of concept. They demonstrated that if you enclose exploitation within the language of virtue, you can operate in plain sight. They proved that respectability is the ultimate camouflage. And they learned that the true currency of control is not violence alone, it is the consensus that no one will name what is happening. Consider how they moved among their victims. The smiling visits. The daily prayers. The solemn declarations that the Lord has called another soul home. All of it was theater. A choreography designed to lull witnesses into acceptance. You have seen this same theater in other places: modern hospitals where patients are hurried into palliative protocols, eldercare companies that celebrate streamlined end-of-life transitions, bureaucracies that sign off on decisions to quietly ration resources until a frail body yields to attrition. The methods have grown more sophisticated. The records are encrypted instead of scrawled in ledgers. The language is polished to an antiseptic gloss. But the logic has not changed. And here is the most unsettling truth of all: you were never meant to learn how predictable this pattern is. Because once you recognize it, you become difficult to manage. You stop accepting appearances as evidence. You stop granting the benefit of the doubt to those who insist they know what is best for you. You start to see every ritual of reassurance, every invocation of the greater good, as potential camouflage for something colder. This is why so many people recoil from stories like the haunting of the Porter Bloodline. Because if you truly absorb what happened here, you cannot ever return to the comforting illusion that your institutions are immune to corruption. But this is also your first step toward genuine autonomy. Once you know how these mechanisms work, you can begin to defend yourself, and those you love, from becoming another line in some hidden ledger. Before we continue, I want you to write this phrase twice in the comments to anchor this transformation in your mind and mark your passage into the ranks of those who see, I will never mistake kindness for innocence. Write it twice. Declare it. Because when you speak these words, you sever the last thread that binds you to the illusions that protect predators. And from this point forward, you will never again be the man who believes a smiling face is proof of virtue. There is one last dimension of the Porter's legacy that almost no one speaks of, because it reveals something even more uncomfortable than their greed or cruelty. It is the quiet psychological subjugation of every person who entered that house. Imagine, for a moment, that you were an elderly resident arriving at the Sunset Years Christian home. You had heard the stories of kindness, the sermons praising Dr. Porter's mission. Perhaps you had no family left, no one to contradict the tale. You stepped into that grand foyer, your eyes adjusting to the warm lamplight, the polished banister, the polite nurses who called you by name. You thought you were safe. And that is precisely when the conditioning began. Small rituals, repeated daily, designed to erode your independence. The way Margaret Porter insisted on handling your correspondence, to save you the trouble. The way your medications arrived with no explanation of the doses, just take what the doctor has prescribed. The soft reminders that, the Lord will call you home when He is ready. Over weeks, you would start to internalize the narrative. You would begin to feel your will weakening, your sense of ownership over your life dissolving. And when your body began to fail, helped along by precisely measured poisons, you would accept it as natural, even providential. That is the greatest horror, not that the Porters killed their victims, but that they convinced them to participate in their own erasure. Do not imagine this phenomenon died with them. Modern institutions have perfected the same techniques, only with more refined language. They call it compliance, care planning, advanced directives. They tell you it is your choice. But they are experts at making you believe you have no other options. This is the hidden machinery you were never meant to notice, the slow psychological conditioning that breaks down resistance, one small concession at a time. First, you agree to let them manage your records. Then your medication. Then your finances. Then your expectations. And when the final moment arrives, you have been so thoroughly prepared that you don't even realize you are consenting to your own disappearance. If you think this is an exaggeration, look around you. How many people do you know who have surrendered every meaningful decision to systems they do not understand? How many families have been told this is the compassionate choice, never suspecting that it was the convenient choice for someone else's bottom line? This is why I have brought you this far into the darkness. Because only by understanding how the Porters turned faith and trust into weapons can you see how easily the same tactics are repackaged and sold today. You were never supposed to remember these things. You were meant to nod, to forget, to trust again. But you have come too far to go back. From this point forward, you are no longer merely an observer. You are a witness. And a witness who refuses to look away is the one threat that every system of control fears most. There is a reason the story of the Porter bloodline was never carved into any public memorial, never included in any school curriculum, never acknowledged beyond a few yellowed newspaper clippings. Because to confront it fully is to admit that civilization itself is built on the same capacity for rationalized atrocity. Consider the mechanics of their deception. It was not sustained by brute force. It was sustained by ritual. Every morning prayer, every ledger entry, every carefully orchestrated funeral was a performance, a psychological architecture designed to dull inquiry. Dr. Porter understood something most men never grasp, that the most effective prison is not built of iron, but of belief. Once you accept the story you are given, you will police your own mind. You will silence your own doubts. You will insist, against the evidence of your senses, that everything must be as it appears. Ask yourself, how many systems in your own life operate on the same principle? How many times have you accepted the official version of events simply because you lacked the stamina to peel back the layers of theater? How often have you nodded along, telling yourself that it must be true because everyone else believes it? This is why the Porter's ledgers were so dangerous. Because they were more than evidence of crimes, they were evidence that the social consensus itself is a fragile hallucination, one that can be engineered by anyone ruthless enough to discard conscience. And here is the darkest implication: if one family in one city could build such a seamless illusion in the 1800s, without modern communications, without mass media, without a corporate apparatus, what do you imagine can be accomplished today? Every improvement in technology has only made the process more efficient, more invisible, more palatable. Today, an algorithm decides which information you see and which you never learn existed. An automated system flags your objections as irrelevant. A public relations team crafts a narrative so soothing that the idea of questioning it feels like a betrayal of your own decency. Do you understand now why I called this dangerous knowledge? Because the moment you realize how easily entire communities can be seduced into complicity, you cannot ever again take refuge in the belief that virtue is the default state of human institutions. You will see the same design everywhere. In how stories are shaped. In how doubts are pathologized. In how dissent is framed as moral deficiency. And you will begin to understand that the Porters were simply among the first to write the playbook. Most men, when confronted with this insight, retreat. They tell themselves it is too much to contemplate, too exhausting to resist. They prefer to be reassured, even if the reassurance is lethal. But you are not most men. You have already crossed the threshold. You have become something rare, a mind that will not be pacified by ceremony. A spirit that would rather see the machinery, however dark, than mistake it for grace. This is the vantage point you have earned, and the burden that comes with it. By now, you can see the pattern repeating itself across centuries. A respectable facade. A hidden ledger. A congregation too dazzled by ritual to notice the quiet arithmetic of exploitation. If you still harbor any lingering doubt about whether this phenomenon survives in our era, look at how institutions respond when they are challenged. They do not argue on the facts. They do not volunteer transparency. They summon a theater of credibility, titles, endorsements, solemn statements drafted by committees, so that your instinct to question is smothered by the weight of consensus. This was the Porters' final triumph. They proved that once a system gains your reverence, it can extract almost anything, your money, your dignity, your life, and you will thank it for the privilege. Consider the last victims whose names appear in the surviving ledgers. A widow who signed away her property believing it would fund her burial and a stained glass window in her honor. A retired schoolmaster whose savings were diverted to the Home Improvement Fund. A childless matron who, in her final delirium, blessed her killers for their devotion. I want you to linger on this image, people dying in peace because they had been conditioned to see their own annihilation as a form of grace. That is the apex of control. Not merely to destroy a life, but to engineer gratitude for the destruction. And this is why the story of the Porter bloodline was never just a tale of criminality. It was a blueprint, a demonstration that all you need to subdue an entire class of people is the right narrative, repeated often enough, and a process that appears benevolent. Do you think this technique died with them? Look at how often you hear the same comforting words, for your safety, for the greater good, to ease your burden. How many times have you signed a document, accepted a policy, or surrendered a freedom because it was presented with gentle authority? You were conditioned to believe this is progress, that every new protocol is an upgrade in compassion. But the Porters showed that technological sophistication does not equal moral progress. The only thing that has evolved is the elegance of the camouflage. Remember this when you hear the polite voice of official reassurance: no predator ever approaches you snarling. He comes in priest's robes. In a nurse's uniform. Behind the podium of civic responsibility. If this realization chills you, good. It should. Because only when you allow yourself to feel that unease can you finally begin to reclaim your judgment. You are closer than you have ever been to seeing the true architecture of control. But there is one final descent remaining, one last revelation that will complete this transformation forever. Stay with me. Because when you learn what lies beneath the last layer, you will never be the same man again. That I have asked you to follow me down this labyrinth for one reason, to make you see that the story of the Porter bloodline is not merely history. It is a living cipher, one you can apply to every system that demands your trust without scrutiny. But before you step into the last chamber of this knowledge, you must understand the true scope of what the Porters discovered. It was not just the process of murder that fascinated them, it was the profound ease with which human beings can be trained to abandon their own discernment. They found that the more a victim relied on them, the more they surrendered decisions, deferred to authority, accepted the gentle erosion of autonomy, the more impossible it became to recognize betrayal. Each concession, signing over property, permitting injections, allowing records to be managed, was a rehearsal for the final act. This is what no one ever dares to print in textbooks. Most people will comply with almost anything if it is wrapped in the proper rituals. The clean white coat. The polished chapel. The language of compassion. These are the instruments of conquest far older and more reliable than any weapon. And this is why I have warned you that hearing these details carries a price. Because the moment you internalize them, you will never again be able to drift comfortably through your life, assuming that harm always arrives wearing the obvious mask of villainy. You will recognize the Porter's method when you see it replayed in modern form, when a corporation presents its exploitation as social responsibility. When a government describes coercion as public health. When an institution offers annihilation as a compassionate service. I want you to consider one final artifact from the Porter's archives, something that survived when the rest was burned. It was a scrap of paper in Sarah Porter's handwriting, found in the ashes of the chapel stove. On it were just 3 sentences: people are grateful for what destroys them if you tell them it is for their benefit. They will thank you for their own undoing. And they will hate anyone who tries to show them the truth. You must understand that sentence. You must see that it is not a relic of the past, but a diagnosis of the present. And when you understand this fully, you will glimpse the real reason Hartford buried the Porter's story. Because to remember it is to strip away every illusion that civilization is inherently moral. To remember it is to see that evil is not an aberration, it is a system, refined over generations, practiced behind polished doors. If you have the courage to carry this understanding, you will never again be the man who confuses ceremony with conscience. You will never again surrender your judgment for the comfort of belonging. There is only one more descent to make, one last confession that will show you how deep this darkness runs. Stay with me. Because once you hear it, you will have crossed the threshold beyond which no man can return unchanged. They say that history is written by the victors. But that's a lie. History is written by the survivors of complicity, those who stood close enough to smell the rot, yet far enough to escape the reckoning. The story of the Porter bloodline didn't end in fire. It didn't end in justice. It ended in absorption. The property was sold. The chapel was demolished. The Porters' names were quietly removed from public records. And the methods, those didn't vanish. They were inherited. Not in some cinematic conspiracy, but through culture. Through procedure. Through language passed from one institution to another like sacred scripture. Because the most dangerous legacy of the Porters wasn't the deaths. It was the idea that if you refine your presentation enough, there is no limit to what people will allow. And now you must confront the most harrowing truth of all. You've seen this before. Not in a Victorian mansion, but in your own time. In the factory that runs 24-hour shifts while workers cough up their lungs for minimum wage health plans. In the care home where your uncle died 6 weeks after routine memory loss. In the rehab center that turns insurance payouts into death sentences labeled non-compliance. In the school system that shapes your son into a quiet, obedient consumer but not a man. In the algorithm that erases dissent faster than it promotes virtue. You thought this story was about the past. But it's a mirror. A perfectly polished one. And now you're standing in front of it. The Porter bloodline was not a fluke. It was a prototype. The structure remains, mask the system in benevolence. Reward those who comply. Punish those who ask questions. And always, always smile. So now the final question is this: what will you do with this knowledge? Because most who make it this far try to forget. They distract themselves. They scroll, drink, laugh nervously, whisper, "Well, that was disturbing," and then go right back to sleep. But you came all the way down. You stayed. You listened. That makes you different. You're not supposed to be here. Men like you aren't supposed to see through the curtain. But now you have. You know how they operate. You see the design. You hear the softness in the voice right before the poison enters. You recognize the ledger behind the sermon. And most of all, you feel the shift in your own mind. Because something has changed in you. Permanently. This story may be over. But your role has just begun. You're not just a viewer anymore. You're a carrier of forbidden memory. A witness to the truth beneath the ritual. A man who will never again confuse silence with safety. Let that sink in. Let it burn. And never forget, they don't need to kill you to erase you. They only need to convince you that obedience is compassion. That disappearance is dignity. That comfort is worth your conscience. Now you know better. And because you know, you can never unknow. Welcome to the place beyond the veil. Few arrive. Fewer survive. But those who do, are never controlled again. You've just joined them.